Greetings, everyone. Erica Griffin here from the DuSable Museum of African American History. I am joined today by Mr. Harry Jones, Independent Curator of African American Experiences. Now, before we get into the meat and potatoes of our program today, let me refresh you about how to get in contact with the museum. So if you're interested in stopping by for a visit, giving us a call, or visiting our website, you can do the following. We are located at 740 East 56th Place, Chicago, Illinois, 60637. That's on 57th and Cottage. If you want to give us a call, you can give us a call at 773-947-0600. We are standing by on the line if you have any questions. You can also visit the website www.DuSableMuseum.org, which has all of the information on planning a visit, our upcoming exhibitions, upcoming events, education department, and also membership and support. So check out any of these resources. They are all available to you, and we hope that we're able to engage with you in any one of those ways. Now, for those of you who are watching us tonight, if you'd like to call into the show, the phone number is 773-738-1060. Let me say that for you one more time. That's actually 312-738-1060. So we are standing by here live, waiting to hear from you, the viewer. So once again, my name is Erica Griffin, and I'd like to welcome you all to Mondays at the Du, your headquarters for all things DuSable Museum. So as you all know, the summer is drawing to a close, but that does not mean that our programs and events stop at the DuSable Museum. We have a lot more to go. Let's take a glance at the website and see what we have coming up. So we have started our brand new Storytime at the Du program. This is for youth ages K or 5 through 2nd grade, 7 or 8, and they are open for families and youth that are interested in learning more about African American history and African American experiences. So how the programs will work is that we will read a story together about African American history, and then we will participate in a craft activity, a make and take that you can bring back with you. We also have our Margaret Burroughs Centennial Film Series that is currently going on and continuing to go on. So upcoming in September, we have the latest installment. We have Portraits of Nikki Giovanni. So for all of those of you who are unaware, this year marks the centennial of Dr. Margaret Burroughs, the founder of the DuSable Museum of African American History. So throughout the entire year, not only will we have events and programs, but even exhibitions dedicated to her memory, her impact on the DuSable Museum, and also her impact on the city of Chicago. So up next, as I mentioned, Tuesday, September 5th, 7 p.m., we will show Portraits of Nikki Giovanni. And again, all of these programs in the Dr. Burroughs film series are free of charge and complimentary. Coming up on Tuesday, November the 7th, we will be showing another edition of the Dr. Burroughs film series. We will be screening The Edge of Each Other's Battles, The Vision of Audre Lorde. So that's two great programs and ways for you to engage with us. We hope that you come out, show your support not only for the DuSable Museum and its mission, but for the mission of Dr. Burroughs. Now we have another amazing member of the DuSable Museum here with us again. Our COO, Troy Ratliff, will be on hand to interview Dr. Jones. So please stay tuned for the interview.
Good evening. As Erica pointed out, I am Troy Ratliff, the Chief Operating Officer. She tried to give me a promotion to Chief Executive Officer, but I guess that probably won't work tonight. Dr. Jones, it is a pleasure for me to be here with you. We've had several conversations, and you're one of the most interesting people I've ever run into in life. I'm kind of an amateur historian myself, and I've learned so much from you. I'm going to do an introduction. I can honestly take the next 25 minutes going over your accomplishments. Let me just hit the highlights. And if you'll excuse me from not going through the whole thing. You're a lecturer, a historian, a curator, a motivational speaker, and a poet. I just found out that he was a poet. He's an Oklahoma native, went to University of Oklahoma, Boomer Sooner, as the foremost authorities on the role of African Americans in the Civil War, an outstanding record of military service of his own. You were a Marine, am I correct?
Correct.
You retired as a captain. after 21 years of service. That's very impressive to us that know a little bit about the military. He was assistant director and curator at the African American Civil War Freedom Foundation and Museum in Washington, D.C. He is currently an independent history consultant and on the board of directors of the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He's worked on exhibits on display across the country. He is a content developer for the National Park Service Museum at the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site in Tuskegee, Alabama. He is also content advisor for the American Civil War Center exhibit. He curated the permanent exhibit at the African American Civil War Museum entitled Glorious March to Liberty. He's the author of a book of poetry, a novel, and historical series entitled Light and Liberty. I could go on and on here, but let me get a chance to talk to you a little bit. Perhaps we'll start with the obvious question. What brings you to Chicago?
I am here as a guest curator for the World War I exhibit that focuses on the 8th Illinois National Guard, which during World War I was the 370th Infantry. And so we're going to tell the story of this rather unique regiment. It is the only regiment in American history where you have from colonel to second lieutenants. All of the commissioned officers were African American officers.
Tell me about establishing such an exhibit. Where do you find the artifacts? Where do you find the information that goes into such an exhibit?
Well, the DuSable has an excellent collection already. They even have the papers of one of the officers, a Captain James Hall. So you already have an excellent collection there. But also the soldiers and officers wrote about their experiences. So we have these first-hand accounts of their experience, whether from the Spanish-American War or World War I. So there's a plethora, if you will, of information on this regiment.
As curator, how do you go about deciding what actually goes into the exhibit?
It's focusing on stories that need to be told, if you will, and it's a preference by the curator. For me, one of the most important things is that the voices of the history makers are heard. So whatever they're giving me, for example, in the war itself, President Woodrow Wilson said that we're going to make the world safe but for democracy. Well, that rang with hypocrisy throughout African American communities in this country. But if you take Chaplain William Braddon, he would say in his writings that we're clearing a path for democracy. So we take his words and we bring that and let them be heard. So it's, as a history curator, your artists are the history makers. And so that's the art that you're curating. It's these history makers. So it's really listening to the voices of the history makers.
And as we talk about World War I and the experience there, we're not just talking about 3 years. As we look at their experience, we're also going to look at what happened to them once they were home.
Once they were home, we look at their foundation, what they do in the war, and then their legacy. So what happens when they come home? What do they leave? What do they leave us? So we're going to take a view of it that's, I'm going to say, 3 periods: before, during, and after.
Great. I have heard you talk a little bit about several of the officers that came home. I was fascinated by the stories that you were telling. Would you tell us maybe one or two here?
Well, one of the officers is a very interesting guy. He was the commander, Franklin Dennison, who's a very successful lawyer, and then you have William Braddon, who's the chaplain, who was the pastor of Brian Baptist Church here. Then you have actually an enlisted man who's very notable, George Duke, who is a civil engineer, architect, and I've learned since I've been here that he's done quite a bit of designing throughout. You can see his work in bridges across Chicago. So these are real contributors. William Warfield, a lieutenant, he becomes very important as a politician here in the city. So these are men who make a difference in Chicago life.
I think it's notable that as I've talked with Dr. Jones, he has demythed some of the things that I grew up believing about both World War I and the Civil War. One of the things that I've always heard about World War I was when the troops were there, they were refused by the American generals and accepted by the French generals. Is that true?
Well, they are, the American general is John Burt Blackjack Pershing.
Yes.
General Pershing begins as a lieutenant after he leaves West Point with the 10th Cavalry. So he's with an African-American regiment. And being with an African-American regiment is like being with an African-American football or basketball team. You know they can play. And so Pershing knows that they can fight. He knows they fight well. He came from an elite regular unit of African-Americans. But when he is in country, ahead of the American Expeditionary Force, their word comes from the British attaché here in Washington that you can't trust these Negroes. And so the British commander, Field Marshal Douglas Haig, he refuses to train them. And Pershing writes him a letter and says, I cannot and will not tolerate your discrimination against these Negroes. They're American citizens. But Washington intercedes, the War Department, Wilson's War Department, and says, don't get into this debate over this. Don't do it. And we're going to sign them to the French. And the French are real happy because there have been these studies from the Civil War on where you have industrial wars, where it's very clear that persons of African descent stay very calm under pressure. They say under industrial war, there's all this fog, this noise, but the African descent soldiers tend to stay very calm and don't get as nervous. Now, one of the things they did write in that report is that the reason the Negro doesn't get as nervous is because his nervous system isn't as developed. In other words, he's cool under pressure because his nervous system isn't as developed. So the French, having read this report and having actually many of the people behind the report were French officers, they're very enthusiastic. They had actually had African soldiers from Senegal that had already been fighting in the war since 1914. And so they really are excited about getting these African-American soldiers. And Pershing tells them in a letter that you're very fortunate to get these soldiers. When you look at their record, these are very good soldiers. What Pershing doesn't have confidence in is the African-American officers. At that time, there is only one African-American officer at the beginning of World War I who was a West Point graduate, and Pershing was a West Point graduate, so he was prejudiced toward West Point officers. And none of the African-American officers deployed in World War I were West Point officers. So Pershing doesn't have a great deal of respect for the abilities of African-American officers. So we can say that. You can call him a good football coach who didn't think we could play quarterback.
I'm going to get in trouble with Erica here because I'm going to veer off a little bit and talk a little bit about the Civil War, because, well, the fact is that I saw a documentary that you were part of that talked about Nashville. Now, as somewhat of a historian of the Civil War, we very seldom talk about Nashville and its importance in the war, and we don't talk about the 13th and their role at Nashville. In talking with you, I've become much more aware of that. So would you talk just briefly about Nashville and how important that was in the war and the role the 13th played there?
Well, Nashville is a logistics hub. And in the summer of 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman conducts his Atlanta campaign. This campaign is heavily dependent on supplies that are coming from Louisville to Nashville and then following his army on down to Atlanta. Well, the 13th and 6 other African-American regiments would provide the security. They would guard the supply lines. And Sherman would go on to write later that he thought that those who guarded his supply lines during the summer of 1864 demonstrated some of the greatest skill and boldness in the history of warfare. And the 13th would boast of being one of the best units in North America. Also, the 13th would be engaged in the Battle of Nashville in December of 1864, and their tenacity was noteworthy. Suffering 50% casualty, they just kept coming, and the rebels had to withdraw from the position, and they sent chase to the rebels. And the victory was something that a Virginia general, who was a Union general, General George Thomas, says, "Gentlemen, the question is answered. The Negro will fight."
And while we're a little bit off subject, Erica's giving me the evil eye as I do this. While we're a little bit off subject, I was also fascinated by your telling me about Buffalo Soldier. Like most folks, I grew up with the idea that the term Buffalo Soldier came from Native Americans, and I found out how wrong I was about that when you explained to me where the term came from.
You know, and this is one of the most interesting historical mistakes that gets repeated over and over again, because many of our leading scholars will not use primary sources in doing this. They'll just assign it because it makes sense to them. And so they'll say the Native Americans call this because their woolly hair and their fighting spirit. Well, that's really not true. You won't find that in any primary sources. But what you will find is a call from Buffalo, New York in 1843 by Reverend Henry Highland Garnett. It's the National Convention of Free Persons of Color. And at this convention in Buffalo, Reverend Garnett says that it is your solemn and imperative duty to take all necessary means that both violence, physical force, and intellectual force are moral, and that it is your solemn duty to take all necessary means, which was a call to arms. And those that answer this call to arms from Buffalo are Buffalo called soldiers. So they become freedom fighters in the decades before the Civil War and during the Civil War. And it's interesting because one of the best explanations of a Buffalo Soldier actually does not come from a historian. It comes from a songwriter and singer by the name of Bob Marley. And Bob Marley's song is more accurate than any academic that I'm familiar with, except for those who simply won't talk about it at all because they'll say, I can't find a primary source. And there are some who can't find a primary source, so they don't talk about it. But it's become very popular to say that it's the colored regulars from 1866 to 1900. There is a book written by one of the colored regulars, T.G. Stewart, called The History of the Colored Regulars, published in 1905, and one of the things you'll note in his book is there's never a mention of Buffalo Soldiers. However, there has been a reprinting of that book where they changed the title to The History of the Buffalo Soldiers. So it's one of those very popular misnaming of African Americans, and it takes you off course, because if you use that term, you will not lead young scholars back to primary sources. And that, to me, is one of the most important things of what we call a unit, a person, is what is going to lead us back to the primary sources so the history makers' voices can be heard.
I must now return to World War I and the exhibit that's coming to the DuSable Museum. Can you give us some idea of what you will be expecting to see if you come to see the exhibit?
You're going to see an exhibit that really celebrates the Chicago community, because this regiment, the fact that you had all African American officers and that you had such a highly educated group of soldiers in this National Guard unit, I mean, you've got civil engineers and enlisted men. Because of that, you're going to see that the crisis in 1915, when it said that Chicago is the most aggressive political urban community in the country, you're going to come to appreciate that. This exhibit will actually bring that out. It is very clear that the reason you have African American officers in this National Guard unit is because the African Americans in Chicago are wielding power.
We think we have a major coup here in that we have the Regimental Flag. And we've talked about that a lot today at DuSable Museum. Could you tell us the significance of us having the Regimental Flag?
Regimental flag is really the identity of the unit. It is the rally of the unit is around the flag. And to have one that's extant, that you can actually put your hands on, is very valuable. Most units do not have extant regimental flags. You can't find them. So in this case, it's available. It will be on loan to the DuSable. So you'll be able to see this flag that is really a gem when it comes to regiments from 100 years ago.
We've also had the opportunity to talk to several people whose parents actually fought in the war. Have you met any of those yet?
I've not had the opportunity to meet any of the descendants. I will say that descendants, I love talking to descendants because I learn a lot from descendants. They lead me to things that academics just can't lead me to information and perspective. So I really look forward to those interviews.
Do we think that we're going to be getting artifacts from families of the gentlemen who fought in the war?
Well, we already have some. like with Captain Hall. And so we have some, and the DuSable has them now. So we're going to be able to share with you what the soldiers actually kept in their own family archives.
Great. We anticipate that this exhibit is going to be up for more than 2 years. Is that right, Erica? Yes, she's saying yes. So this, you get an opportunity to see, you'll have a good opportunity to see what's going on there. It's probably the type of exhibit that you'll visit more than once, do you think?
I think that any good exhibit, you need to visit more than once, because you can't get it all. And what I hope mostly from the exhibit is it'll lead you to greater discovery when you leave the museum.
Great. I think that the opening date for the museum, for the exhibit is in November of this year. We're hoping that you will come out and take a look at the exhibit. I hope to have you around at that time of the opening so that you'll be able to talk with some of the people and tell them about your experience in putting the exhibit together.
I will be here. I'll make it a point to be here, and I'm really excited about telling this story.
And I'm excited about getting a chance to talk to you more and more. Again, not just about World War I. We have gone off subject to talk about Civil War, and in fact, we had some conversation recently about World War II and the Pacific Campaign, and I was very much interested in your take on MacArthur and World War II and the Pacific Campaign. I see plenty of documentaries about that campaign, but I see nothing about the black soldier in that campaign.
When it comes to African American soldiers in American history, there's a lot of suppressed stories in American history. But when it comes to African American soldiers, this is probably one of the most suppressed areas of American history. It's rarely talked about, especially how outstanding they perform from the Revolutionary War through today. Their performance is absolutely outstanding, and that's one of the greatest things about this story about the 370th, the 8th Illinois National Guard, is that if they had been assigned to an American unit, these officers, by practice, would not have been cited for their leadership and courage on the battlefield. However, since they were assigned to the French cited 31 of them for their leadership and courage on the battlefield. In other words, it's pretty clear the Negro could play quarterback.
Great. And back to World War II, the Red Ball Express. I've always heard an awful lot about the Red Ball Express. Any comments on that?
Well, it's their tenacity made sure that the resupplies were there.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things where you could always depend on African American soldiers, and that's one of the things throughout the history. And so you see that in World War II with the Red Ball Express. You see it with almost any African American unit. And some units are very small units, so we don't hear about them as much, but they're quite outstanding. And one of the history of what we now call special ops in America, in the United States, dates back to the Civil War through World War II, where you've had African Americans in special units performing in exemplary ways.
Same, they tell me, is true throughout the Civil War. Once the Negro soldier was allowed to fight, that the respect he garnered from his actions went throughout the service. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. But this is often suppressed. One general would say of African American soldiers, General Benjamin F. Butler's, better soldiers never shouldered a musket. He would also say, and I'm going to quote him exactly here, he says, quote, I observed a very remarkable trait about them. They learned to handle arms and to march more easily than intelligent white men. My drill master could teach a regiment of Negroes that much more of the art of war sooner than he could have taught the same number of students from Harvard or Yale, close quote. They were outstanding from the beginning. They performed outstanding on the battlefield. They performed outstanding on occupation duty. They were outstanding soldiers, and that is the legacy and the history of African American soldiers, and that story will be told in our World War I exhibit.
Great. I could go on forever with this conversation, but I'm looking at Erica, who's telling me that I can't. So, yes, ma'am. I am so pleased that you were able to come here and we were able to have this conversation. I look forward to talking with you at greater length at DuSable Museum, and I look forward to having you come out and meet him and see the exhibit. It will open in November at DuSable.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.